Let me begin by saying that this is a sermon that happens to be preached on Mother's Day, but this is not a Mother's Day sermon. I'm going to speak about some aspects of family relationships, but I don't want to mislead or frustrate anyone who's looking for a Mother's Day sermon. This will also be a sermon in two parts because I feel compelled to begin with some comments on the radical history of Mother's Day and how that contrasts with the Supreme Court and the leaked majority opinion on Roe versus Wade that happened this week. We're planning to give a fuller treatment of those issues soon, so my reflections today are more introductory on that subject. What I remember most about Mother's Day from my childhood are the peonies. We'd fill a vase with cut flowers, and I'd try to rescue all the ants that were crawling on their stems. We'd have a breakfast together, and then after breakfast, we'd go to church, where the pastor would hand out carnations, so many carnations, to all the mothers there, as well as to the oldest mother, the newest mother, the mother with the most children, the mother of missionaries, and so on. And I remember people clapping, and I remember lots and lots of Hallmark cards. I don't mean any of this in a condescending way. It was a very meaningful day to a lot of people because our community was collectively pausing to say thank you for hard work that was often overlooked and taken for granted. But it was also a painful day for a lot of people, including those whose mothers had passed away, those who were estranged from their families, especially from their mothers, those who had lost children, those who regretted becoming parents, or those who weren't able to have children. So it was a strange day at church, too, with some folks showing up who usually didn't show up, and others staying at home because it hurt too much to be there. I suspect that dynamic will be even more present this Mother's Day today, as headlines have filled the news this week about the draft opinion by the Supreme Court overruling Roe versus Wade. But while you've likely been sorting through emails, articles, podcasts, memes, and protest invitations in response to that draft, I suspect that most of the churches in my city will be celebrating this morning. Overturning Roe versus Wade has been a long-term goal, and they've made no secret about that. And I suspect that these celebrations will be conflated with their observances of Mother's Day, repeating the idea that attacking reproductive rights and extolling patriarchal values somehow supports mothers and families. That is in stark contrast with the origins of Mother's Day, which didn't begin with either the domestication of women or the commercialization of gratitude and love. For example, in 1858, Anne Maria Reeves Jarvis encouraged a Mother's Day movement to promote sanitation and in response to high infant mortality rates. The holiday was also used as an opportunity to help reunite families that had been separated by the American Civil War. And in 1870, Julia Ward Howe wrote a Mother's Day proclamation that called for mothers to help bring an end to war by standing up to their husbands and teaching their children not to kill one another. By 1914, the feminist movement and its demands had grown in strength, and leaders were lobbying President Woodrow Wilson to set aside the first Saturday in May each year as Women's Independence Day, in recognition of the right and necessity that the women of the United States should become citizens in fact as well as in name. They were also organizing events across the United States to celebrate and to demand the right to vote and to read a woman's version of the Declaration of Independence. But President Wilson was not ready to fully support suffrage, and he denied the request to meet with him. Instead, he pivoted to proclaiming Mother's Day as a holiday, affirming the importance of women while stopping short of affirming their political and social identities and rights. As Kimberly Hamlin wrote last year, this proclamation, along with the resulting commercialization of the holiday, didn't go over well. In her words, shortly after Wilson declared Mother's Day a federal holiday in 1914, women like Jarvis, the daughter of Anne Maria Jarvis, became disillusioned with the frivolous commercialization of what to her should have been a sacred and sincere commemoration. Indeed, in 1933, Jarvis even wrote to President Franklin D. Roosevelt asking him to remove the federal mandate from Mother's Day, Why? Because instead of equality, health care, peace, safety, and support, Mother's Day had become an occasion for vapid expressions of love and reverence, increasingly characterized by flowers, brunch, and store-bought cards. More significantly, Jarvis's opposition signaled the celebrating motherhood had become symbolic, not substantive. One could even argue that Mother's Day provided a superficial placeholder in lieu of policies that actually would benefit mothers. End quote. I still love peonies, but the Mother's Day that I experienced as a child was much more consistent with that more superficial version than the original fiery cries for equality and justice. It's strange to realize that over 100 years later, the superficial vision has survived and even flourished, often incubated in the patriarchal visions of fundamentalist religious communities. A few years ago, Esther Vivas commented on that patriarchal ideal. She wrote, "According to the traditional patriarchal view, there are only two types of mother: the devoted, self-sacrificing mother and the bad mother." And that binary has been a useful tool in preserving patriarchal power. And in my experience, it has invigorated the anti-abortion movement for decades. These insights bring us right back to the present day, when we also and still encounter these kinds of dynamics. With the draft opinion by the Supreme Court, a clear path towards increasingly restrictive laws on abortion, accompanied by harsher penalties, is opening up. What is less clear is any discernible way that this will actually benefit pregnant people, or children, or families and communities. After all, it's well known that outlawing abortion doesn't end abortion. It just makes it less safe. However, we do have a pretty good idea about the kinds of things that are likely to create safer, happier, and healthier communities. And it looks a lot more like the activism of Anne Maria Jarvis promoting public health and sanitation than it does the opinion of Justice Alito. The kind of policies that should be getting our attention and our support, and that our politicians should be exploring and championing are policies like comprehensive sex education and access to contraception, universal health care, and that includes access to abortion, as well as access to pre- and postnatal care, generous parental leave, access to parenting education and caregiving necessities, so that nobody has to wonder if they'll be able to afford diapers or a car seat or formula, wages or tax credits for unpaid housework and caregiving, especially for parents who stay at home, universal child care for parents who work away from home, and universal preschool education. And as this list implies, we cannot separate reproductive rights and reproductive justice from social, racial, and economic justice. Greater restrictions on reproductive rights, including abortion access, will disproportionately harm marginalized communities, including and especially the poor, the disabled, queer and trans folks, and people of color. There is no question that the stakes are high, and they've been made higher this week by that leaked draft opinion. So this Mother's Day has been infused with a greater political and social significance by the leak of that draft opinion. Protests have already rippled across the nation, coupled with calls for a general strike, a strike that is beginning today, Mother's Day. And that is fitting. As Hamlin wrote, "This history of Mother's Day reveals women activists have never considered brunch and a card an adequate way to recognize the work done by American mothers, especially after a year in the pandemic in which they've done so much more of it. Returning Mother's Day to its original roots compels us to reflect on our nation's long-standing disregard for maternal and infant health, among the worst in the industrialized world, especially for women of color, along with our persistent refusal to enact legislation that would provide meaningful support for working mothers." End quote. There's a lot more to say, including all the impacts the court's decision will have on other issues, from privacy to marriage equality. This will also involve facing again and transforming patriarchal, racist, ableist, and other violently repressive ideas and institutions that survive today and continue to harm us. The news this week was hard, but we expected something like this was coming. And although there is a lot of work ahead of us, it's not separated from the work that we've been doing for a long time. So for today, we reconnect with each other as well as those whose hard work has brought us to this moment, those activists and fearless leaders, named and unnamed. We take a deep breath, come into this present moment, and resolve to keep working together to create communities where justice, well-being, and joy are real. With that said, forgive me for clumsily turning to my original topic for today. For years now, we've been discussing different aspects of how to manage broken relationships, especially relationships strained by increasing polarization within American society. Debates about abortion have certainly been a part of that polarization. More recently, transgender rights and critical race theory have shared that spotlight. More troubling, the wild proliferation of conspiracy theories has further divided family members, co-workers, and friends. More and more people speak with me about feelings of isolation and loneliness and a helplessness that goes along with that, not knowing what to do. Even before the pandemic, more than 40% of Americans reported feeling that their relationships weren't meaningful. And 20% said that they rarely or never feel close to people. These feelings of disconnection and isolation include our family relationships. And in 2020, Carl Pilmer of Cornell University documented the results of a large-scale survey on estrangement. The study found that 27% of respondents had completely cut off contact with at least one family member. And since that's information that a lot of us aren't going to be excited about revealing or willing to share, the actual number is probably much higher. We can add to this tally those relationships that are strained but not yet broken. And when we pause to acknowledge that reality in this way, we glimpse the enormity of pain and stress that we're carrying around. As Pilmer pointed out, this rejection and powerlessness has a cumulative and harmful impact on our well-being and the well-being of our communities, weighing us with both grief and a sense of incompleteness. And that weight is a chronic stressor. It just keeps piling up, especially when it includes family members where we experience bonding and attachment in the past. This kind of estrangement is also the slow fruit of long conflicts and destructive relationship patterns. Abuse, whether emotional, verbal, physical, sexual, or a combination, is at the very top of the list of common causes of this estrangement. Those are deep wounds requiring a lot of time and care to heal. Divorce is also a common influence with various causes, from feeling pressure to choose between feuding parents to finding new conflicts in a blended family. But it's also increasingly common to find that conflicting values are behind a growing number of those clashes. In one study, value-based disagreements played a role in more than a third of rifts between mothers and children. These differences in values are the kinds of differences you would expect that fill the news and fill our conversations, issues of gender, sexuality, religion, and politics. As we well know, these differences have been amplified by the polarization of most of popular life in recent years, fueled by popular political candidates and cultural and religious leaders who stoke xenophobia and conspiracy theories. And some people have been surprised by this shift. But the reality is we've been working hard as a society to create these conditions for a very long time, seeing the stoking of anger as a really expedient means to get what we want done, and purposely wedging people against each other as a way of getting action to be taken. My own estrangement from my extended family has been twofold. The values-based disagreements, those are certainly present. It became very difficult to attend family gatherings with someone, for example, who was openly carrying a firearm and who also held racist, misogynist, homophobic, and transphobic views. There was just no way for me to realistically feel or be safe in that situation. But underneath the values-based rifts was a deeper unwillingness or inability for our family members to honestly engage with harmful patterns of abuse and dysfunction. I've always maintained that I'm willing to do the work. I hope I'm willing to do the work, to honestly engage with, heal from, and transform those kinds of patterns. But I'm not willing to pretend that they don't exist and expose myself and my loved ones to further harm. That makes me one of those statistics that Pilmore lamented, estranged from several extended family members for many years. I've also connected with many people with similar experiences to my own. Very often, we've lived through a merging of unhealthy family and religious experiences and cultures. These experiences connect deeply with issues of trust. Growing up in communities that tolerated abuse and dysfunction, the lesson that many of us learned was doubly harmful. On the one hand, I felt pressure to trust everyone, at least everyone in our family or our church community. Distrust was a sign that something was wrong with me, because the people in our circles were good by definition. We weren't encouraged to heal and transform unhealthy relationships because that would require acknowledging that something was wrong in the first place. And that was generally not allowed. Especially in our conservative church culture, problems were only permissible in the past tense. You could sometimes share the problems you were facing if they weren't too scandalous, but only after you had resolved them. Then it became an opportunity to give testimony about how God had changed your life. But we didn't really ask for help with relational problems, especially not publicly. Instead, we learned to quietly hide them away, perhaps out of helplessness or shame, and always to our collective harm. In such an environment, vocalizing distrust came perilously close to unmasking how broken our relationships often were, and that was too big of a risk. In such a culture, though, trust became increasingly impossible, especially for any of us who had experienced and suffered abuse. The reality was that while we felt pressure to trust everyone, we often didn't trust anyone. How could we? Especially when the people who hurt us were also the people society insisted that we had to trust. Over the years, I found my own experiences mirrored in the stories that countless people have shared with me. We were all asking these questions. How do we trust when we so often were harmed by the very people we were taught would protect and care for us? Over time, we learned that the way to stay safe was to assume the opposite about people. Distrust becomes the default. So this is where I find it necessary to start. I grew up learning that trust was an either-or proposition. Through decades of tending to both my own healing and supporting the healing of others, I've learned that trust is more like a spectrum. At the far ends, we have dysfunctional or unhealthy patterns of trusting and distrusting. Dysfunctional trust is the tendency to trust when we should be exercising boundaries and caution. At the extreme, dysfunctional trust puts us in a position to be harmed, especially repeatedly. We stay in unsafe and unhealthy relationships and groups too long. We also risk normalizing those destructive relational patterns to the point that we find ourselves tolerating or even protecting or even promoting them. On the flip side, dysfunctional distrust is a tendency to distrust no matter what. It often arises out of a legitimate need for self-protection. We refuse to let ourselves be harmed again. But we do this in a way that leads to isolation and sometimes even paranoia. We resist forming any relationships at all because the risk of that kind of connection, that kind of vulnerability, is too great. So we avoid cultivating safe and healthy relationships. This feels like a reasonable cost to pay when compared with the cost of getting hurt again. And it often feels like a reasonable cost even when we are desperately in need of community and connection. And between these two extremes, we find varying degrees of trust and distrust, and there in the middle is the sweet spot. That's where we find trust that is healthy and relationships that are supportive and caring. But it's also where we find distrust that is healthy, where we are honoring the process of building or rebuilding trust. Healthy relationships cannot be coerced. And if you take one thing away from these reflections, my guess that the most helpful idea for most people is simply this: distrust can be healthy. It isn't automatically or inevitably healthy, no more than trust is automatically or inevitably healthy. But distrust can be and should be an important part of how we grow into strong, healthy communities. It's part of how we honor our bodies and honor our needs, part of how we get in touch with our boundaries and our limitations, part of how we practice compassionate communication, and part of how we learn to give and receive care without hurting one another. We practice these skills internally, inside ourselves, and with each other, in our personal relationships and in our communities and in our organizations. Cultivating a culture of trust helps all of this to happen. It provides the perfect conditions for us to actually be able to trust. Time and again in conflict work, I've noticed that when parties in a conflict can't trust one another, they may be able to trust a mediator. And that's why we spend a significant amount of time in pre-meetings with each party in a conflict, building rapport. That trust can then become a bridge for the parties to meet each other again. Similarly, in a community or organization that takes the time to cultivate a culture of trust, we have a much better chance that conflict won't become overwhelming. We have a better chance of resolving a difference before harm is done. And we have a better chance of healing when harm does occur. On the flip side, it is much more challenging to address a problem of conflict when we don't feel and are not safe. This isn't easy work, and the reality is that some relationships are not safe to continue in any form, and we have to walk away from them. Single traumatic incidents can destroy trust in a moment, but distrust can also emerge out of the accumulation of unhealthy relationship patterns. Especially in this latter case, the situation may get gradually worse and worse and take years to recognize that there's an unhealthy pattern there at all. In my experience, this often means that we're prone to staying in unhealthy relationships for too long. Unfortunately, these aren't usually situations we're prepared to explore, and so we get stuck. So in the conflict work, we often go to these kinds of questions, such as, when do I feel comfortable addressing problems? What practices and values help me feel both safe and empowered to work through a conflict? When am I least likely to feel that safety and power? How do I recognize when trust or distrust has become unhealthy? And what tools and skills have been most helpful? And what tools and skills do I still need? Getting practice like this in our personal lives also gives us insight into how we can create environments and communities where it's safe to heal from dysfunctional forms of trust and distrust, where we can learn to practice functional trust and distrust instead. Going back to that Cornell study on estrangement and reconciliation, Pilmer shared that most instances of healing, when that estrangement was able to be addressed and reconciled, involved 1, moving from a focus on the past to a focus on the present. 2, envisioning what a future relationship might be like. What would it mean to have a healthy relationship that honored both parties' needs? And 3, shifting a focus from trying to change the other person to adopting more realistic expectations about what was possible. I would further clarify that the shift from past to present is one where we move from adjudicating the past, what really happened, who is to blame, who is right, to healing in the present. How did what happened change us? What wounds still need to be healed? How can we cooperate in this healing? We can then explore the boundary between what is possible and what is healthy. What needs am I trying to meet in this relationship? What needs are appropriate to meet in this relationship, and noticing when there's a gap between those? What needs are realistically possible to meet in this relationship? And how might I meet those needs that don't fit well in this relationship so that nothing gets left out. When you think about it in these terms, you can probably recognize that we are already experts in navigating trust and distrust. For example, I like to think you can trust me with a whole lot of things, but you really shouldn't trust me with, say, repairing your car. That won't go well for any of us. We're constantly making decisions like this, and we can tap into that wisdom to help us navigate more challenging relationships. I find that especially helpful in discerning how to relate with someone with whom I have a significant difference in values. And sometimes the answer is still, there isn't a way. But even then, the process has been valuable to me. Finally, another aspect is the importance of centering the voices and needs of marginalized people. Oppression is the most severe and cruel normalization of harm, and it destroys the possibility of trust. This means that prioritizing justice and equity are part of the restoration of trust and the healing of both people and our society. Similarly, the well-being of marginalized and oppressed people is the measure of the health of a society, and any work we're doing that ignores this dynamic will ultimately undermine our efforts, whatever our intentions are, and no matter how good those intentions are. And this is important because our vision of justice and equity is a shared vision. It's about learning to live together without harming one another. It's about being able to heal from that hypervigilance that so many of us carry around because we finally feel safe and we finally are safe. It's about being able to relax and laugh and enjoy life. Social justice work is at its heart relational work within ourselves, with each other, and in our communities and organizations. Making room for us to understand and practice the spectrum of trust supports this vital, healing, life-giving work. So I want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who has supported my own healing or the healing of others. Thank you to everyone who has shared in this work, caring for our most painful wounds with compassion and creating together communities where we can finally trust ourselves and one another with the fragile, precious, and wonderful joys of life. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.